For the whole of my adult life, I've been opposed to the death penalty. And I thought it might be a good idea to lay out some of my reasons as to why I currently think that the death penalty is a bad thing. It's not an entirely abstract question. I participate in an organisation called Lifelines, and one of the things that Lifelines does is it matches you up with a pen pal on death row in one of the states of the United States that still uses the death penalty. There are all kinds of justifications for the death penalty, some of which are not compatible with each other. And so rather than try and address all the ways that people defend the death penalty, I thought that I would try and put forward my own fairly specific reasons for opposing it. And my reasons are very much derived from the tradition of virtue ethics. So I don't claim that my reasons are ultimately original. Anyway, here we go. Why am I opposed to the death penalty? I believe that all human institutions, the government, the educational system, the justice system, the economy, etc., all human institutions exist for one purpose, if that is a good purpose. And the only purpose for which they should exist is to enable as many people as possible to flourish as much as possible. You can tell if a government or an educational system or a justice system or an economy is no good if it undermines the capacity of the citizens to flourish, or if it allows some members of the community to flourish at the expense of their neighbours. So when it comes to the question of criminal justice, I believe that all criminal justice should be medicinal, to use the phrase which Thomas Aquinas uses. It must set out to heal the wounds of injustice, thereby enabling those who are damaged by injustice to flourish. The criminal justice system must seek to bring at least some measure of healing to victims and perpetrators and the wider community, not just to victims and not just to the wider community. The whole idea of justice is to maximize the flourishing of as many people as possible, and that includes the perpetrators of crime. And crime, of course, is best defined as something that undermines human flourishing. So, as part of this, I think it's really important that we need to recognize that a lot of crime is the result of a failure on the part of the wider community. Those who commit crimes are all too often, although not always, the victims of poor parenting and or poverty and or defective education and or defective environmental influences, for example, gang identity. The medicine that is needed to deal with crime often begins in the home and or the school and or the local community. When the community heaps all the blame for crime on the perpetrator, it fails to acknowledge its own share of the blame. We are humans, not sea turtles. Our whole formation, from the moment of our birth, depends on the family and community into which we are born. So the big question that the criminal justice must answer is, does the death penalty promote the healing and therefore the flourishing of both victims and the community, as well as the perpetrator? In the most literal sense, killing the patient, if we're going to talk in medicinal terms, in other words, killing the perpetrator, is by definition not the way to heal them. I get the impression that there are those on death row who do in fact undergo a personal transformation for the better as a result of being sentenced to death and spending a protracted period of time awaiting execution. However, I suspect that these are probably the minority of people on death row. I suspect the overwhelming experience of being on death row in the United States is enormously destructive and very far from medicinal, and probably true in other countries too, about which I know much less. But I'm also sure that it's unlikely that the death penalty has a medicinal effect on the collateral victims of crime. In other words, in the case of murder, for those who love the murder victim the best. In some cases, and maybe even in most cases, the collateral victims of murder believe that whatever healing is possible depends on the execution of the perpetrator, the fabled closure that it is supposed to give. However, what nobody seems to notice is that the death penalty encourages people to want to see a fellow human being killed. In other words, it puts them in a position indistinguishable from the mindset of many murderers. And what is more, they are metaphorically hiring the state to do the killing, which again I think is very hard to distinguish from contract killing, which I understand is one of the forms of murder commonly defined in the United States as murder one, i.e. the kind of murder that invites the death penalty, murder in the first degree. In other words, the death penalty turns some of the collateral victims of murder into murderers. Nobody is healed if they've been encouraged to wish the death of another. Jesus himself taught us this in the Sermon on the Mount, when he talks about nursing anger in our heart against our brother. Well, that we've already committed murder when we've done that. As far as the wider community is concerned, the existence of murder in many, but in not all cases, is a symptom of a sick community, as I've already suggested. In other words, a community in need of medicine, of healing. However, the death penalty basically puts all the blame on the perpetrator by inflicting on him, and it's usually a male, the most extreme punishment. By doing this, I think it deflects attention from the defects of the influences that have a distorted effect on the character of the perpetrator. In other words, it's a way of avoiding the medicine. In the USA, it also comes more naturally in a culture that places such a huge emphasis on personal responsibility, often at the expense of recognizing the importance of community responsibility. Now, some will say that criminal justice systems are notoriously bad at healing perpetrators. They will point to the number of criminals who, on being released from prison, go on to commit more crime in the case of non-capital offences. Now, to some extent, I believe that this depends on how wisely the criminal justice system is structured. Some systems are better structured than others. They're better attuned to the medicinal effect of punishment. And that, of course, also depends on how well resourced they are. To them, even with the best resourced criminal justice system and the most wisely resourced criminal justice system, I would still say that actually the complete eradication of crime will always be impossible. After all, I believe in original sin. I believe that we all have the potential to be criminals, and we never really lose that potential. But just one more comment, in this case a comment on the death penalty as a deterrent. I would point out that the effectiveness of the death penalty as a deterrent is disproven every time a death sentence is passed. Some murderers were never going to be deterred from their crime because they were acting on impulse. They didn't give a second thought to the possibility that they might face the death penalty. And some murderers commit their crime because they don't believe that they will ever be caught, which makes the deterrent effect of the death penalty dependent on the detection rate and the awareness of perpetrators of the detection rate. When it comes to the United States and religious justifications for capital punishment, I noticed that some documentaries, that some members of the public in states like Texas justify the death penalty by quoting scripture, a life for a life, which is to be found in the book of Leviticus chapter 24. But the problem with that is that the state of Texas does not act in accordance with that scripture. Any system that differentiates between capital and non-capital murder is not acting in accordance with the principle of a life for a life. If you believe in that principle, all convicted murderers should be executed, and maybe all convicted of manslaughter as well. I realise that this is a brief and incomplete defence of my position on the subject of the death penalty. But anyway, this is one way to start the conversation.